This is Behind the Verdict. I'm John Horford with Marion Cook, and today we are talking about the JonBenet Ramsey case. And this is a part 2, so if you haven't listened to part 1, please make sure that you go back and listen to that first before listening to this episode. Irene, when we ended the last episode, you had mentioned something about statistics. What statistics do you think are important to share in this case and for listeners to keep in mind?
So in looking at this case as the murder of a child, I looked on several different FBI statistics sites. And the one that was resonating the most with me is it said over 72% in all child murders, it is a family member who killed the child in their own home.
Yeah, 72%.
72%.
That's massive. And then you found additional statistics to just prove that it's almost always someone that the child knows. So it being someone that the child knows happens what percentage of the time?
It was 87% according to what I looked up.
So the stranger danger fear that we were all essentially raised on isn't actually as factual statistically as we think. The real danger is people that we know or children know, unfortunately.
Exactly. At least that's what the stats show. And these stats went for a good 10-year period that I looked at all these different stats.
So you'd say pretty accurate and from a very reliable source.
Yeah, the FBI is pretty reliable on their reporting sources.
Yeah. So, I mean, it just goes to show that it's very likely, with all the other evidence found, the strange, super long ransom note on the legal pad that came from, the Ramsey's home with the second draft, or with a first and a second draft. It's very likely all of these things added up. JonBenet's body being found in the home, in the basement. How unlikely, just based on when Patty had called the police. Patsy? Patsy, sorry, Patsy. Patsy called the police. There's no way this syndicate, this foreign cell of people could have gotten her out, gotten her back in, put her into the basement, and left without being seen by anyone in the family. And then law enforcement's crawling all over the neighborhood, and they're not seen by them either. So all these things put together, and it's like someone in the Ramsey home killed JonBenet Ramsey, whether intentionally or unintentionally. That's
what it seems like. And, when we started talking about doing this case, I did a lot of research and I looked into it. And I had a hard time with this because when you look at the pictures of JonBenet, she is the most beautiful little girl. And I'm not talking about the pageant pictures where she's all dressed up. I'm talking about the one of Christmas morning that year where she got a brand new bike and she's sitting on it and her hair is messed up and she's excited and she's got the biggest Christmas morning smile on her face. I had a hard time, not only as a prosecutor, but as a mom, trying to figure out what happened to this little girl and why can't we solve this? We solve so many other issues. We solve so many other cases across the country. Why haven't we found out what really happened to her? And I think she deserves that. She deserves to be able to rest knowing that what happened to her finally came to light. So as I looked at some of the things and I re-listened to our last episode, I had a couple things that stood out, a couple red flags that I wanted to bring up and get your opinion on. And one of them was that when the Boulder prosecutor's office, the Boulder DA, exonerated the Ramsey family, he talked about saying things like the parents had passed their polygraph examinations. Now in Michigan, polygraph examinations in and of themselves are not admissible in court for a variety of reasons. Yes, they have gotten better and more reliable over time, but it's only the pre-interview done by the police and the post-interview done by the police that could be admissible because those are admissions potentially by the person, the suspect, right? But the problem I have with polygraphs is we don't know if those polygraphs were administered by a reputable law enforcement polygrapher. Was it a private polygrapher hired by the Ramseys to ensure that they passed. But the bigger issue I have is, depending on how you ask the questions during a polygraph, you might be able to pass it. I had a case that was a sexual assault of a daughter, and this daughter was developmentally delayed. And so one of the questions initially to this dad, who we all knew had sexually abused his daughter, was, did you sexually assault your daughter? Now, in his mind, what he finally confessed and told everybody is he wasn't sexually assaulting her. He was teaching her how to be a wife. So if he convinced himself and thoroughly convinced himself so he didn't have to feel the guilt, maybe he could pass.
So if you're delusional enough, then you believe your lies enough, you can pass these tests.
Maybe.
Yeah.
But again, if it wasn't a reputable polygrapher who works for law enforcement or with law enforcement generally, I don't know, was this other person good, not good at their job? Maybe they were, but it's a red flag for me.
If it wasn't from someone who was reputable, like the people who did, if it wasn't law enforcement who did the polygraph test, or like a reputable source that, the court had used, why would the judge give it credibility by saying, oh, well, they passed a polygraph, they're good?
It wasn't the judge that gave it the credibility, it was the DA's office.
So why would the DA's office do that then?
I have absolutely no idea.
That's
I think
strange.
it sounds stupid.
So then it has to come from, in their mind at least, it had to have come from a credible source.
Well, you would hope.
You would hope. Okay.
I'm going to leave it at that.
Okay.
Because I think they made some missteps here too. But a couple of the other things that stood out was Patsy had said that Burke was asleep and was not woken until law enforcement arrived at the house the morning that they discovered JonBenet was missing. However, law enforcement had analyzed the 911 call that Patsy made at 5:52 in the morning, and you can hear Burke talking in the background. So did she misspeak, not realizing he was awake? I mean, that seems kind of like a big deal.
It does, but I guess there's a lot going on, and you're pretty frazzled in that situation. But at the same time, I guess that lends credence to the theory that you believe, which is that Burke was involved and the parents helped to cover it up. Do you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, we can. I have a couple more things I want to hit on, just real quick.
Please do.
You're really playing devil's advocate here. I'm gonna work really hard to convince you otherwise.
I appreciate that.
One of the other things too is if you're a home intruder and you're planning on kidnapping a kid and you are asking for ransom, are you gonna take the time to write a note on the family legal pad that is lengthier than ever, and then take the time to actually murder, sexually assault, and do anything to that child in the home? Wouldn't you just take the child out of the home and then you could do what you wanted, when you wanted, for as long as you wanted? Why run the risk of doing it at the house?
Yeah, I mean, and the length of that note, and I know we mentioned in the last episode, but there was 2 drafts, and it was a long note. It's like someone sat there in a chair, like kicked up their feet and just started like writing this out. There's no way, if you were worried about getting caught, that you would do that. That's so time consuming. Seriously, how long do you think it would take to write out as much as they did?
A long time.
Like 10 minutes?
At least, because you have to stop and think about all the things you're saying.
Yes.
And, I'll be honest, if they claim they are a foreign faction, their English was pretty good, using words like attaché case.
Yes, it was great. So they're from England.
Sure, that's it.
Yeah, so somewhere in the UK.
A fluent family member in a home in Boulder, Colorado. But, either way works. But here's one of the pieces that, as a prosecutor, I don't understand. They presented all of this evidence. Law enforcement and the prosecutor's office in Boulder presented all of this evidence to a grand jury. And the grand jury makes a decision whether they vote to indict the person, the defendant, the suspect, or they vote not to indict the suspect. And so I remember watching the TV and waiting for that to come out. Like it was breaking news. The grand jury has made a decision. So everybody around the nation is glued to their TV at that point in time to see what happened. And the Boulder district attorney came out and said, there is not enough evidence to proceed with this case. we will not be formally filing charges against the Ramseys. That's pretty much all he said. He didn't take questions. Now, what does that lead you to believe? What do you think, based on that alone, that the grand jury did?
The grand jury decided that there was no way that they were guilty and that they shouldn't continue pursuing them.
Yeah, no. Years later, it actually came out from grand jurors themselves who said, we voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey for child abuse in the death of their daughter.
Yeah.
They voted to indict. They felt there was enough.
So how does that happen then?
Because ultimately, it is up to the prosecuting attorney, or in this case, the district attorney from Boulder, Colorado at the time.
So they can totally blow off, even if the jury is like, it's this, they can be like, it's not, we're good. Like,
it's a charging decision, so it's not an ultimate decision on guilt or innocence like we'd have at a jury trial.
Yep.
Right? It is a charging decision. Is there enough to indict? And they said yes. Now, the Boulder DA, once that information came to light, made some statement in the media that said, well, I didn't think I could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay, well, you know what? We run that risk every single day with every single case we're looking at. Can we prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? What else do you need to show?
I think the tough part in this case, just from my limited understanding of the law and just, how some of these cases unfold, you don't know. You absolutely know, almost, that it's someone in the family. Like, there's just too many details that point, but it's like, who in the family, I guess. You don't know which one it is.
Right.
It could be the dad, it could be the mom, it could be Burke, but you don't know. So I guess maybe that's where you said it was DA?
Right.
I guess that's where they were at, maybe. Like, it's someone in this family. We just don't know who. Or should you still proceed if that's the case? Would you still proceed? You would probably recommend, obviously, proceed, but
I probably would, because if the grand jury, this independent panel, reviewed all of that evidence and said, yeah, I think there's enough, then we owe it to the victim in this case to try to see if there's enough, right? Now, I think there were missteps with law enforcement, and that could be problematic, and I understand that fully. I think there were two detectives initially on this case. One was of the mindset it was an intruder. It couldn't have been the family. And he believed that until he left the force, he continued to work on it for the Ramsey family. He died several years later, fully believing that it was an intruder that killed JonBenet. On the other hand, though, you had another detective who worked on this case who also left the Boulder PD because he fully believed it was the Ramsey family who did this, and he fully believed they should have been indicted, and he fully believed it was not being investigated the way he felt it should have been.
I mean, I don't know how anyone believes that it's anyone but a family member. Now, whether it was intentional or unintentional, I mean, the fact that ransom note is saying, like, we have your daughter, follow these steps, or, you're never going to get her back. And then they obviously call the police, which violates, one of their rules. And then her body just appears back in the house somehow that it was supposedly taken out of. Like, it's just, come on.
It seems implausible. It seems crazy. I don't know whatever word you'd like to insert here, but it seems very far-fetched that that's the circumstance.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different theories out there. And one of the theories is that maybe it was the brother Burke who did something. Now, there's a couple different ways they've thought about it. They thought maybe he had been sexually abusing his sister and it went too far, or it was accidental by him and the parents decided maybe to try to cover it up. So they've already lost one child and they can't do anything about it, but perhaps they could save the second.
Yeah. And he was young.
He was young. I think he was like 8 or 9 years old. So
Yes.
he was not very old. JonBenet was 6.
So, a question for you.
Yeah.
As a prosecutor. And I know that 9 is a little young. So, obviously, you wouldn't be able to send a 9-year-old to prison.
No.
Correct?
Correct.
Yes. But in Michigan, at least, you can send a 14-year-old, 14 in one day.
So in Michigan, there's something called an automatic waiver, where if a juvenile commits a series, an offense that is on a list of the worst. So if you think of the worst, murder, criminal sexual conduct in the first degree, kidnapping, and there's a list of others that are basically the worst of the worst crimes ever.
Yeah.
If a juvenile commits one of those, they can be automatically charged as an adult. You don't deal with the juvenile justice system. You deal with the adult system.
So do they go to prison?
They would go to prison, but
Not when they turn 18, but when they're 14.
they would go to generally juvenile facilities. Sometimes they've been sent to special prisons. I mean, it kind of depends on the circumstances.
Yeah.
But if they're convicted of, say, murder in the first degree, generally for an adult, that is life without the possibility of parole. There have been cases around the nation and that have applied Michigan law that say for a juvenile lifer, you have to have a special hearing to prove why it should be life without parole. Otherwise, it's somewhere between 20 to 60 years is the actual number. So feasibly, you could do it. But there's also a magic number in the law for juveniles, which is 10 years old. At 10 years old or up, they are presumed to be competent, right? Under 10, it is not.
So Burke is close.
He was close, but I don't think Burke, in my opinion, did anything purposefully intending to kill his sister. At least not anything that I've seen.
Despite the fact that she was sexually assaulted. Weird, right?
I think that was a cover-up.
Oh, like they did it to, oh, really?
Yeah.
So they sexually assaulted her after she was killed.
I know it sounds
so they
weird.
could blame
I know it
an
sounds weird.
intruder.
But think about it. If you're trying to do a cover-up and you want to shift any focus from the family itself, that's one way to do it.
I guess. I mean, assuming that they think that no one would ever think that the dad or the brother could sexually assault JonBenet, but like the statistics that you stated at the beginning of the episode show, more likely than not, when somebody is in a situation that leads to death, it's a child, it's a family member, or it's someone they know.
You know, I wish I could say with 100% certainty how this happened, but I can't. What I can try to do is look at all the red flags, look at all the things that make me question what law enforcement thought, what the DA's office thought. Is it weird that they would do that? Absolutely. But this whole case is weird. The whole circumstance and set of everything is weird.
The fact that they did beauty pageants is weird.
Well, that's odd too. But you know, there were a lot of people initially who thought Burke had sexually assaulted her. He did this, accidentally killed her, and the parents covered up the death. I don't know many 9-year-olds who know what a garrote is.
Yeah.
Right? So I don't know that kid would have had the knowledge to use a broken paintbrush in his mom's art supplies, tie a rope around it with very fancy knots, wrap it around his sister's neck, and then know what it means to twist a garrote for asphyxiation purposes. It just doesn't seem like it fits.
Yeah. So you think they did all of that? Is there no way to tell from the autopsy that was done post-mortem?
They believe that the skull fracture certainly could have killed her because it was very extensive.
Yes.
But the ligature marks in her neck were very deep. That rope actually cut into her neck quite a bit. So I don't know.
But there's no way to tell whether that was done after she was dead?
Sometimes they can tell that through lividity, meaning the pooling of the blood and some things, but I didn't see anything that gave an indication they were able to say which came first or which was the final. I think it actually said on her post-mortem examination that her death was due to the massive skull fracture as well as asphyxiation.
Yeah. What do you think? You have a theory about what caused the skull fracture, correct?
Well, it's not my theory. It's theories that I've read
or
over
a theory
time.
that you think is plausible.
So you go all the way back to the pineapple chunks in her tummy, right? So the family said she hadn't had a snack. She was asleep. They put her to bed. That was that. But we know, based on what was found in the contents of her stomach, she had eaten some pineapple and it was undigested, meaning she ate it shortly before she was killed.
Very shortly before she was killed, probably.
Right. We do know Burke was sitting at the table with a bowl of pineapple and milk eating that. Now, did JonBenet come down and get some pineapple out of the refrigerator herself? Did she come through and steal it from her brother, which ticked him off, and maybe he chased her and maybe she fell and hit her head, or maybe he threw something at her and hit her in the head, or maybe he hit her with something, not meaning to kill her, but just ticked off, maybe he didn't want her touching his food. I don't know.
Yeah.
But you have to have some sort of plausible explanation for why that pineapple's in her tummy when the parents said she didn't have any.
Yeah. But I mean, the parents have been wrong or have lied about things before. Like they said that Burke was asleep, but you can clearly hear him in the background on that call that Patsy had made to police.
And if you can hear him on the recording, that means Patsy would have likely been able to hear him even clearer, right?
Yes, exactly.
At the time that it happened.
Yes.
So, I don't know. So it seems to me like maybe Burke did something on accident, maybe. Or at least that's what these theories are saying.
Yeah.
But, he, at one point, there was a CBS special that came out and kind of put forth that theory that it was an accident and the parents covered it up. And I believe this was a few years ago, and Burke Ramsey actually filed a lawsuit against CBS and won a substantial sum in a defamation suit.
Yeah.
So I'm not here saying Myrene thinks this is the case. I'm saying this is one of the theories that have been floated out there as a potential.
Gotcha. Safer that way too.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
What do you think the theory might fit?
I think that sounds most likely that it was Burke, that it was some sort of interaction between the two of them, and maybe he threw something. I don't think she accidentally fell and tripped and hit her head, because if she did that, I feel like the parents would have had a reason to call the police and be like, our daughter fell, and the circumstances would kind of prove that and show that. I think he did something that could be interpreted as malicious or violent, and then they freaked out and tried to cover it up. But it was 100% someone in that house. You look at everything, there's no way these people snuck it back in. There's no way the intruder's sitting there with their feet kicked up, writing a multi-page ransom note that took 10 plus minutes, and it was a second draft. No chance.
I looked at some of the photos online from the crime scene, and you can still see the bowl with a spoon sitting in it at the kitchen table. So that's where Burke was eating his pineapple. As you go into the kitchen, which is right off the dining room, there's a kitchen island, and there's a very large black Maglite heavy looking flashlight sitting right there on the counter. Was that used to hit her in the head?
Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know if that was ever tested. Maybe it was tested and maybe it showed nothing, or maybe they didn't think to test it because at the time they thought it was a kidnapping.
I also think it would be hard for a 9-year-old to potentially throw a Maglite flashlight, now that I think about it. But I mean, it could be something else. Who knows? And then why would they keep it there instead of, trying to hide it or put it somewhere? I guess they could have just washed it off and then put it back.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they didn't realize what it was. Maybe she fell and hit her head on the floor. She fell, and I don't know. It's so many different options that it could be. One of the theories I read said when she was carried down to the basement, her head might have been slammed onto the concrete floor. I suppose that is a theory, but it would have to be awfully hard to slam a 6-year-old's head down onto the floor.
And why would you just toss her like that?
Right.
I don't know.
It doesn't make a lot of sense.
No, it doesn't.
Another theory out there was that John Ramsey had sexually been abusing his daughter. That's why you have the garrote, which is a more fancy adult type of thing, right? And that just went awry, and he did it too tight, and she died accidentally. I don't know if I believe that either.
She was a little 6-year-old. A garrote just seems so excessive.
Doesn't it?
It really does. It really does. Unless you're trying to, like you've sort of alluded to, frame someone else or make people think that it was someone else who did it. So that's why you brought up the sexual assault that you thought was done after death, and then the garrote. Why?
Right. You know, sometimes garrots and asphyxiation are a form of pleasure in sexual type activities. We've seen them in other sexual assaults and in other types of things. It's a possibility it was that, but it doesn't seem likely. When you look at the tone of the ransom note, they want money. That's all they want. They don't seem to talk about the other pieces of this that made it so salacious. Sexual assault, the garrote, all of those types of things. They don't say, we have your beautiful daughter. They say, we have your daughter.
Yeah.
Right? So it doesn't seem like the people who allegedly wrote that note are ones who were focused on her from pageants, were focused on her beauty, were focused on sexually assaulting her, at least not from that.
And they had weird details like this specific $118,000, and that just happened to be the same amount that Mr. Ramsey was getting as a bonus
Right.
that year. Super strange. Like this foreign syndicate like just happens to know how much your bonus is.
Right.
Like, come on, dude. But I guess that goes to the next theory, the intruder theory. And there was unexplained DNA evidence found on JonBenet, correct?
There was some unexplained male DNA found. Now, it wasn't seminal fluid. It wasn't a bodily fluid that they could articulate by any means. So that takes out that theory of
So what was it?
I don't think they explained that, but they were very clear it was not seminal fluid.
Yeah.
Okay. But they even went so far as to look at the company that manufactured the underwear that she was wearing and go all the way back to the factory, I think it was in China, to see if that male DNA might have matched anybody that worked there.
So they went that far, but then they didn't even investigate everybody who was at the party 2 days before?
Yeah, I don't know if they did or they didn't.
Oh, okay.
That could be one of the things that maybe they did do. But if you did all of those things and this is an unsolved case, why would you not release it?
Super strange. But I guess there were lots of mistakes and lots of weird decisions made throughout the course of this investigation.
Hindsight is always 20/20, and we can go back and look at something and think we did our best, but look at it with fresh eyes or fresh analysis for scientific DNA or other types of things and go, gosh, we should have done this or we should have done that. But in this case, there were a lot of those. I mean, a lot.
And do you think any part of it was intentional? Because like the Ramseys potentially had influence because they were, somewhat wealthy, maybe known in the area or had friends within like law enforcement.
I don't see that. I don't see any evidence of that. And I don't want to think that. I think people that get into careers involving law enforcement do so because they want to do the right thing. And I don't want to believe it's anything different unless you can show me proof of that.
For sure. But they're still human. At the end of the day, like, maybe there's a world where they sympathize with the Ramseys and they knew that it was an accidental thing and they didn't want Burke to have to face backlash or whatever it was. I think that's another reason why I think that it was him, because it's easier to feel bad for a 9-year-old who accidentally did something like this versus an adult.
You said a key phrase that caught my attention. They're human. I think law enforcement in this case was human, just like everybody else, and I think they made mistakes. I'm sure if they could go back and fix it, they probably would have secured the crime scene and protected the evidence on the body and protected the evidence from the scene where she was located.
And thoroughly investigated, like searched the house, like the fact that she was found in the wine cellar downstairs.
Right. All of those things I'm sure and I'm hopeful that they would have taken the time to do differently. But at the end of the day, what we have is a case where we still have a 6-year-old who's dead. The murder is unsolved. There have been fingers pointed at the family, pointed at potential intruders, pointed at a lot of different areas. But what I want to know and the question I want to ask is, why haven't we been able to solve this? That's a big why.
It seems like because of some human error. I mean, on the part of law enforcement, the DA's decision to just ignore the jury's recommendation, crazy.
I would really like to have a conversation with that DNA or that DA to say, hey, prosecutor to prosecutor, can you tell me why you didn't feel this? And maybe there's some insight that they had that we don't know.
Absolutely.
Maybe there is.
But why isn't that public?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I can't imagine, because if I was going to make a decision where I decided, you know what, I'm not going to charge the Ramseys, even though they were voted on by the grand jury to be indicted, I'd like to have a pretty solid base as to why I'm making that decision. It would seem to me you should have a solid base in making that decision.
Yeah, to absolutely help to justify, like, this is the reason why. And people can look at it and be like, okay, that makes a lot of sense, versus this, because this looks crazy.
Right. But there is somebody out there who knows what happened to her. There is somebody who was there, who did it, who saw it, who's heard about it, something. And I can only hope and pray that someday they come forward, because JonBenet deserves to have that. She deserves to be able to rest.
Absolutely. Is there anything else about this case that you want to touch on before we wrap up? And I guess it's always unsatisfying, for people when it's, there's no conclusion to this. It's still open.
I think as humans, we want to solve things. We want to solve an equation. We want to solve a puzzle. We want to get from the beginning to the end and know what happened in the middle. And this is one of those cases where we just don't know what happened. And I think it's frustrating. It's sad. It's infuriating at times. And I really wish there was a way that we could solve this.
Yeah. But no additional details. This is where you want to end it.
Well,
No pressure. No pressure at all.
Thanks.
We totally can.
I just thought of something we didn't talk about. So when the evidence was presented to the grand jury, they had two very famous DNA experts who were presenting the DNA evidence that the grand jury heard. One of them was Dr. Henry Lee, and one of them was attorney Barry Scheck. Do those names sound at all familiar to you?
No, not at the moment, but Alex is laughing, I think. So yes, they do to him.
Well, they should be, because Dr. Henry Lee and attorney Barry Scheck were heavily involved in the O.J. Simpson murder trial.
Oh, yeah.
So Dr. Henry Lee testified on behalf of the defense, and attorney Barry Scheck was one of the most prominent defense attorneys in the nation at the time who understood DNA. Because at the time of O.J., the DNA and analysis and all of those things was kind of a newer science. You didn't hear as much about it. So in the JonBenet case, they had those two experts testify.
Was that before or after O.J.?
After.
Okay. Well, they did really well with O.J.
Don't get me started on the O.J. case.
Well, I'm going to get you started on the O.J. case, because I think that's going to be the next one that we're going to have to look into.
Oh, we have lots of things to talk about on that one.
I can't wait. I haven't seen your eyes light up like that in a long time.
Since the last time I got sassy on air, right?
Exactly. I think that was the Lacey Peterson case. If you haven't listened to that one, you should go back and give that a listen. Myrene is at her all-time sassiest.
So far.
Well, on the air. You guys don't even understand. Me and Alex try to get Myrene to be as sassy on air as she is off air, because we know that the public would absolutely love it.
Well, there are some cases I feel very strongly about. Lacey and Scott was one of them. JonBenet's one of them. I said, but once we start on the OJ case, we have lots to talk about.
Well, then you all need to make sure that you tune in to see this epic level of sass that Myrene is going to display.
No pressure.
No pressure at all. And if you have any questions, we'd love to hear from you. Please message us on our Instagram page or our TikTok at BTV_pod.
And if you like us, please rate us on those sites as well, and leave comments. Let us know how we're doing. Let us know what you think we should talk about on future episodes.
You can find us wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.